How's everyone doing today? Seems like great energy. I'm excited. So our topic is what consumers want, which kind of makes me think about that Mel Gibson movie, What Women Want.
Not sure we'll be able to answer all that today.
I don't think Mel Gibson could either. So what do consumers want? Do they want healthcare? I mean, and that might seem like a really simple question, but you know, as someone who is relatively healthy, I'm not really thinking about my health on an active basis, and I kind of don't want to. I just want to live my life.
Yeah, I guess I think back a little bit to 10 years ago when the App Store first launched. My previous company, MapMyFitness, I remember going out and visiting with investors, and people were like, "No one's going to run with their phone. Like, why do you think this is a good idea?" And I was like, "No, everyone's going to run with their phone. Everyone is."
I do look pretty dorky, kind of like holding my phone like
yeah,
this.
but you got your music, you got your safety, etc. And I think there was a sort of a feeling that quantified self was something that was really, really narrow, that was only going to be this really small group of people. And I think what's happening is this sort of shift from, really reactive healthcare to proactive means that hopefully we can integrate it seamlessly into our lives in a way that, really everybody wants it at some level.
And we hear this a lot, this whole idea of the consumerization of healthcare. Do you like that term? Are we consumers when we are in this sort of healthcare setting, or are we something else? Because it's not like buying an iPhone when you are a consumer of health. You have all these other things to worry about. Staying healthy is a totally different equation and often not a rational choice.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is hard to deem it that way because you think about, like, as an example, my father has type 2 diabetes, and I don't think he thinks about it like buying a consumer product. You know what I mean? Like, it's a very, very different experience for him, and it's very real every day, right? Because he has to take insulin and all these things. But I think for the average consumer, the question is how do you integrate it so seamlessly that it's something that you actually, don't necessarily consume the way you would go to, Target and buy a product or something like that, but something that literally is sort of integrated into your lifestyle.
And that's what you're hoping to do with your new company, Helix, which seems like a totally futuristic idea, but it's, here today, this whole notion that we could even potentially start to use genetics to sell products and to tailor and personalize products.
Yeah, so I mean, Helix really is we hope a revolutionary idea that, someone can sequence once their, in our case, an exome or a full protein coding area of your genome, and then use that over and over. But I think the important thing from a, sort of consumer perspective is that getting a report all at once that has everything in it isn't really the way people digest anything or consume anything, right? They tend to go utilize things that are important to them, at that moment or that they have an interest in, and then learn about that area and then potentially move on to something else. And I think the idea of the Helix platform is that we don't actually know which categories and which things might be most interesting to someone, and that they're going to come in from all of these different areas. And that's where they're going to start their journey about learning about whether it's, healthcare in general or their health in general, to maybe a very specific topic like, as an example, Venome that, will tell you your taste genetics and what wine you might like.
Based on your DNA.
Based on your DNA, yes.
So I'm curious from the audience, how many people have ever had their DNA sequenced? Oh, wow. It's quite a lot. And when I guess, when I say DNA sequence, I don't know whether I would include things like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA, because they're doing something different, which is genotyping, right?
Yes. So I think Jay Flatley, our chairman, said it best last week, that in a perfect world, specifically in thinking about consumer products, you really would even do the full genome, right? That if cost was no issue or the cost was zero, you certainly would try to get all of the data so that you could build and understand as much of it as possible. Realistically, microarrays exist because they were the best cost option to start building products. And, Helix is really in a position to offer the full exome at a price we think is consumer friendly for the first time at scale. And so I think, even if you think about the technology today on your phone, you probably wouldn't go out and buy a camera from 10 years ago on your phone. As a consumer, you really would want the latest and greatest camera phone and product in the market. And I think that's really the difference between microarrays and where we're headed with exome and I think eventually full genome.
So I was looking at the new site a few days ago because you guys just launched it, right?
Just launched, yeah.
And it was about $80 for the first time sequencing, and then you guys were charging kind of a mix. It was anywhere from like $100 to $500 for all of these different applications, and it was kind of like the App Store but for genetics.
Yeah.
So how did you get to that price point? Because it's if I try to get my exome or genome sequenced anywhere else, it would be a couple grand.
Yeah. So we are subsidizing to essentially get people onto the platform and try their very first product and learn, in the first step, whether that's in fitness, ancestry, nutrition, whatever it might be. That $80 kit price is really the threshold we felt like consumers would have to be at to say, hey, this is something that I want to do. But like the App Store, we don't actually set the other prices. So the partners that are on the platform get to set their own prices, and then similar to the App Store, we revenue share with them on that product price.
And those partners, you had, some folks that were doing healthcare testing, which we've all seen before. But then there was a company that would put my DNA on a scarf in the fashion category.
Yeah.
So which do you think will drive consumer adoption more? Is it going to be the sort of fun ideas or more of the sort of medical, important stuff that you would need to know for your health?
Well, I think the market's already proved out that health and ancestry are going to be big categories here. From the space I was in fitness nutrition, I clearly believe those will be big categories, especially as more and more new discovery happens as you marry this phenotype and genetic data together. But I think the important part about a true, sort of app store is that you don't actually know what the consumer wants, and you actually have to offer diversity and breadth to make it possible to understand where all those consumers might come from, and also to make it a reoccurring thing. I mean, if you think about, certainly when Apple or Google launched, no one knew really that Uber or Airbnb or MapMyFitness, frankly, were going to exist. But part of the reason everyone in this room keeps going back to the App Store is because it's complete, that there are things across a very wide spectrum for you to choose from and try over and over and over. And I believe that Helix has to offer a similar type of situation from a consumer standpoint.
And have you tried any of this stuff? Like, do you have your DNA on a scarf?
I did order my scarf. I think this will be a big Christmas item for sure. It's super cool. I mean, the company's really amazing. But I think the products, from my perspective, I mean, I'm a cyclist. I have been sort of in the fitness, nutrition category. But I think the products that are most exciting are the ones that are starting to look at, that are merging the genetics with Helix, biome, blood, all together. Because I think that perspective starts to give the consumer some really interesting insights that are, have double confirmation, really start to tell them something about, how they might change behavior on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis.
And a lot of us still have some concerns about sequencing our DNA. This is really sensitive health information, and we do have some laws that protect us from things like discrimination.
Sure.
But it's not totally complete, and there is this loophole with life insurance and disabilities and so on.
Sure.
How are you educating people on that, and how are you getting people to overcome some of those fears and use the platform?
So, first of all, I have this saying that I use internally a lot, which is I do think it's important for us to really talk to the consumer regularly about not only what are we doing with the data and how it's potentially going to be used, and how and what parts of the data the partners are potentially going to get and be able to use, and then they have to be very clear about it. So, whether we're working very closely with things like consent or research consent that the partners might be using, how we might be using it. But I ultimately, I think every company would say the same thing about protecting data. They'd say, we're doing everything we can. It's the biggest deal inside the company. My feeling is that, trust, which ultimately this is what it comes down to, is, earned in drops and lost in buckets, right? I mean, that's what happens, right? So we have to do everything we can to slowly build up that trust with the consumer and make sure that our partners are doing the same, because clearly it's the most sensitive data from my perspective that potentially could be out there.
And speaking of data, who owns it? Do you guys own it? Do I own it? And can I get it back?
So we certainly have a position that the consumer owns it. As I said, we are subsidizing the cost of running your exome up front. So right now we're working on functionality where the consumer could download their full exome, pay the essentially retail price for that, and take it wherever they want, wherever they might use that. We do obviously own a copy of that, and then once the consumer buys the partner product, that partner then asks the consumer the right to take that portion of the data that they're using inside of that product specifically.
Got it. And you were before Helix, because you joined about a year ago, right?
Just a little bit over a year ago. Yeah.
So you worked for Under Armour, and they had just acquired your company, MapMyFitness.
Yep.
So in that journey, what have you learned about what consumers want and don't want? Is there any big surprises that you could share? Something that you assume that consumers want that they in fact don't? Anything to kind of help out our audience?
I think I go back a lot to the idea that I do believe consumers want seamless integration. I mean, I think one of the things I realized at MapMyFitness maybe 3 or 4 years in was, often products and services will just keep adding functionality to them. They just like, hey, let's pile on the next thing that we're going to layer in front of the consumer and hope that you can then tell that story. We started to sort of curate and actually take stuff out of the product. So I do believe in this idea of simplicity and really being narrow about what it is that you're offering that the consumer can digest. Like that's kind of what I go back to even on the Helix platform. Like we could have launched, it could have been a company where we launched our own product in the market and just basically put everything out there possible in every different vertical. But I just, again, don't believe that's how consumers want to digest this, whether it's this information, healthcare, or consumer products. If you look at the hardware that Under Armour launched, even there we tried to basically take things out. Other companies were adding more and more functionality to wearables. We were actually trying to take things out to make it even more simple, for the consumer to use on a day-to-day basis.
So, as a reporter, I've had a lot of people speculate to me that wearables are dead. Mm-hmm. And as someone who worked in wearables and built those products for Under Armour, what do you have to say about that? Do you think that the wearables trend is coming to a close, or do you think that there is sort of a next opportunity?
I speculated a lot when I was there. I think I mentioned this on the phone, that I think what's going to happen with wearables is that it's going to turn into real wearables. I mean, the true wearable is what all of you have on, which is your clothes, right? And so as technology gets better and better, smaller and smaller, it will integrate into these lifestyles. Like the product that's actually doing the best that we built was integration of the chip data into the shoe. Completely seamless. Like basically you could go for a run, you didn't even need to take your watch, anything, and it would sync the data when you got back. But it was just a shoe. You couldn't see the technology at all. The consumer didn't have to think about putting on something, hitting a start button, anything. It just started on its own, ran while you were out, and then synced up to your phone afterwards, and you had data when you were there. I think those types of products are the products that I believe are going to be, really integrated into everything. I mean, literally everything.
I mean, one of the best quotes that I've heard on kind of wearables is they either have to be invisible, so like integrated into the clothing, or beautiful, so you'd be proud to wear them.
Yeah, I definitely 100% agree with that. I mean, even if you, in Fitbit's world, if you look at some of the stuff they did with, Tory Burch and others, I really thought that was the trend that was going to happen. I mean, even the acquisitions of like Fossil with Misfit, like I think all of that sort of merging together is certainly what we're going to see.
Does anyone here have a wearable in a file drawer right now?
I have a few.
So we're getting close to questions, so think of the stuff. But we talked about this backstage, and I told you I would ask you, if you had unlimited resources to do anything in healthcare and life sciences, I just gave you the money right now, what would you do? What would be your moonshot?
Unlimited. I really think this idea of bringing all of the data together in a very seamless way. So I think, part of our challenge in health and fitness, all these things on a day-to-day basis, is we actually don't have all the data, and we certainly don't have all of the lifestyle data merged with the workout data, merged with the blood data, the genetics data, all of these things. And I think the moonshot is really the people that will be able to bring all of this together in an extremely seamless way that then looks across large populations that can tell us things that we simply haven't discovered yet. I believe that is where the future is headed.
Actually, a lot of my reporting indicates that Apple and Amazon are moving into this area as well, of wanting to integrate health data together. Any thoughts on that? And you don't have to confirm anything.
I don't know that much about. I mean, other than what I read in your articles about what's going on at these companies. But it makes sense to me. It makes sense that what you've seen Apple do with HealthKit and things like ResearchKit, et cetera, that they are trying to bring as much of that data, because they certainly have the big missing piece, which is the lifestyle data, because most of you, how many of you have your phones at least 16 to 18 hours a day on yourself? How many? Yeah, so the lifestyle data is largely there, and then you see acquisitions they just did like Bedit, to get even your sleep data. So I think it's all moving in this direction where the
medical record on the phone,
everything all into
and
one
in the cloud,
spot. Yeah, and I think that data is the transformational data.
Great.
I guess I would consider Apple or Google and or Amazon and Apple having unlimited resources for a moonshot.
That they do. So does anyone have any questions?
David Hansel, Naked Biome. One of the best things about the App Store is the overwhelming majority of apps are free. Is Helix going to provide some dribbles of free information from the exome as time goes on?
Yeah, we've certainly talked a lot about what are the types of products that we can offer, almost what I'd say is pre-sequencing in some ways, right? And then other small pieces of information that might be integrated into brands. Maybe a very simplistic one might be something like caffeine metabolism, that a lot of people in this room probably shouldn't drink coffee after maybe 2-3 p.m. in the afternoon, even though you might like to. Might disrupt your sleep, and then you don't feel good over time. I think you will see small bits, but again, always approved by the consumer in those other experiences that might be accessible across a large number of applications.
Hi, my name is Laura Yeses, and my question for you is what to do with difficult data. So some of the information that people are going to get back after they do one of these tests might be something that is quite disturbing and perhaps not actionable. Is there any plan or services to go along with the tests?
Yeah, so we actually have a partnership with a company called Genome Medical that essentially we're making available genetic counselors that somebody could call and talk to about all the products. So we're training them in all of the products on their platform, and we'll make that essentially in real, if the person wants to call right away after they get some result from, again, whether it's a nutrition company or it's a health company, that they would be able to get that information quickly. I think the other part, though, is how do you really build communities where people have and can access and start to ask, in some ways, even their community questions about it. And so, how do we open that up at some level? But I think our first step is really offering these genetic counselors as a way for people to ask questions in real time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here today. We had a great conversation.
Thank you.
And let's definitely keep in touch. If anyone has
Awesome.
any more questions, you'll be sticking around?
I'll be around.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.